Our guest this week is Lori Wallach, who's the Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch Division and is the absolute leading expert on globalization, the World Trade Organization, and these so-called free trade agreements. She's been described by the Wall Street Journal as, and get this, Ralph, and I'm quoting from the Wall Street Journal, Ralph Nader with a sense of humor. Welcome, Lori Wallach. What do you think of that, Ralph? Ralph Nader with a sense of humor.
I don't think that's funny. I think Lori does have a sense of humor, as listeners will soon see. She uses it as a way to get points across based on very arcane legal sections of what are called free trade agreements, but are anything but. So let's get underway. Lori Wallach graduated from Harvard Law School, and she started working in the litigation group, Public Citizen. And I thought there was a great opportunity for her in the emerging battle for new kinds of trade agreements that are forms of transnational governance, secretive decisions made, sidestepping our regulatory agencies, our legislatures, and our courts. And at that time, in the early 90s, people were not aware of this. They weren't aware of anything but the nomenclature. That is, free trade, win-win, everybody wins. You know, it's the old free trade mantra a couple centuries ago where the British sold textiles to Portugal and the Portugal vendors sold wine to the British, and they were both comparatively advantaged, and everybody won. It's quite different now, and on this program we're going to hear from Lori as to why it's different. First, by laying out the structure of these trade agreements and how radical they are against our constitutional and open government traditions, and then going to how they have actually affected working people and communities in this country and consumers. And then I know she wants to talk about the forthcoming Pacific Trade Agreement that President Obama is wrapping up with Asian and other nations and is going to submit to Congress. One other thing you must know about Lori, she is obviously relentless, persistent. She's been all over the world in symposiums and action arenas, helping people oppose the rapacious impacts of these agreements. And once you get them concrete, they really are pretty mind-blowing in how cruel and vicious this organized corporate multinational greed can be, using government for its own purposes. She's also well known on Capitol Hill. I introduced her to a number of senators and representatives in the pre-fight for NAFTA and WTO. She now has great credibility on Capitol Hill, and she may have some surprise projections for us about the way the House of Representatives is going to receive the Pacific Trade Agreement, which she has described as NAFTA on steroids, if and when President Obama sends it to Congress on fast track. So take it away, Lori. Why don't you describe the structure of these trade agreements and how they affect consumer, environmental, and worker rights, and not just trade?
Well, the first thing for everyone to know is that these trade agreements aren't mainly about trade anymore. So we've all been subject to a rather clever misbranding campaign where this concept of free trade, which most people think of as cuts in border taxes, tariffs, that's what free trade used to mean, is been used to basically slide through what is effectively a system of enforceable, global, corporate-led governance. And the way it works is that these so-called trade agreements, let's just say the World Trade Organization, the thing that replaced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, that was a trade agreement. It only covered border taxes on things you could drop on your foot. If it wasn't an actual product, it wasn't under GATT. In comes the WTO. Everyone just is told it's a bigger, stronger GATT. But in fact, of the WTO's 17 chapters, only 6 of them have anything to do with trade. The other 11 chapters set up binding policies, and we all have to conform all levels of our domestic policies, local, state, federal law, to these rules. So what kind of rules? Well, there's an intellectual property chapter that expanded the monopoly period of patents that the big pharmaceutical companies had on medicines. What did that mean practically? The U.S. went from a 17-year monopoly on medicines to a 20-year. That means 3 extra years for the big pharmaceutical companies to charge anything they want for medicines. So the University of Minnesota found that that alone was a $17 billion increase in the price of medicines just for the medicines that were under patent at that time. So WTO, instead of being free trade, is new monopolies for big companies raising prices for consumers. Or there's another chapter that limits the kind of food safety protections that we can have in our country. And it doesn't matter if those rules apply to domestic food and imported food. There's simply a ceiling on safety. For instance, we're required to accept meat that is considered safe under some other countries' standards. And by the way, some of the countries under those rules are now bringing in meat. Hate to do this to those who aren't vegetarians already. Our countries have privatized their food inspection system. So you've got countries like Australia that have astronomical rates of E. coli in their chicken production who are sending their products here. Oh, and there's a whole set of limits on labeling of food. So we can't even know the country of origin of the food. Or in WTO, there's a whole chapter to deregulate the banksters. So during the 90s heyday of deregulation, those guys got their own chapter in WTO that limits a lot of the key financial regulations that we need now to make sure that the bank doesn't take our house, to make sure that we don't have another financial crisis. All of those things having nothing to do with trade under the brand of free trade. And because we've all been told free trade, it's so good, those words, such good news, free trade, who doesn't like both things? Congress, when WTO and NAFTA were under consideration, really was largely clueless, despite our best efforts, that this wasn't a trade agreement. This was like a slow-motion coup d'etat by corporations, because if any country doesn't change all of its domestic laws to meet these rules, which, by the way, don't sunset, you can't change a comma unless all the signatory countries agree.
How many are there?
160 in WTO now.
Each one with the same vote, right?
Each one with the same vote. And if you don't change your laws, you face trade sanctions. That's just the punchline of it. It's actually enforceable, unlike most global rules. You don't comply with these retrograde rules, your country gets slapped with billions in trade sanctions that don't go away until you cave in and get rid of your consumer protection.
So, Lori, this to me sounds, not to sound conspiratorial, it sounds like corporate world government. I mean, it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, these agreements are all made to bypass domestic laws and safety standards, health and safety standards.
Your perspective is exactly right. And what has happened, basically, is that to the extent the rules have been enforced, time after time, domestic, environmental, consumer, and other laws have been rolled back. So just in the U.S., under the WTO, we've seen the dolphin-safe tuna rules rolled back. So everyone knows in the tuna fish there's that little smiling dolphin label. That no longer means that Flipper didn't die. The standard used to be no tuna can be sold here if it's caught with those nets that drown, the circle nets that drown dolphins.
Right.
No. After one of these trade cases, the U.S. rolled back the standard to avoid the trade sanctions. All it means now is no one on the boat saw Flipper die. It's literally a rollback of the standard after a case to avoid the sanctions. Or Clean Air Act rules on gasoline cleanliness, put into place to try and counter the epidemic of asthma in our cities, rolled back after a successful WTO case. Or Endangered Species Act rules that were put into place to try and save endangered sea turtles, rolled back. And right now, the WTO is about to impose sanctions over President Obama's landmark 2009 laws on tobacco, keeping kids from smoking, and on a policy relating to the country of origin labeling of our meat.
Those examples you gave indicate what countries challenge the U.S. in those tribunals in Geneva to get their way, starting with the tuna.
Well, this is the perverse thing. Right now, as we're going to talk about, we're having a negotiation for a thing called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it includes Mexico, a country that has repeatedly used the WTO to attack our domestic consumer and environmental laws. Because NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, just like that WTO, mainly not about trade, enforceable, all these corporate rules, chapters imposing retrograde policies having nothing to do with trade. Under that agreement, Mexico has also challenged our rule that requires that only trucks domiciled in Mexico that meet our driver safety, insurance, and environmental standards can come into a certain part of the U.S. And Mexico's using NAFTA, the similar tribunal system with the sanctions, to say, no, you have to allow these trucks to drive any place in the U.S. And, of course, president after president, Democrat and Republican, has said, but wait, these trucks aren't safe. Sorry, $3.2 billion of trade sanctions were imposed. President Obama has allowed a pilot program to allow in those trucks.
Laurie, can you explain how it overrides domestic sovereignty? I've often said that these trade agreements involve the greatest surrender of U.S. sovereignty, local, state, and national, in U.S. history. Every treaty involves some relinquishment of sovereignty so nations can get together, sign on, and pursue a common objective. But in this case, give the example of child labor, which is illegal in this country. Under WTO, countries using child labor exporting products to this country. That tells me how our sovereignty is being overridden. You remember Tom Harkin tried to do something about that in the U.S. Senate. Can you explain that?
You bet. So let me just first practically explain what the key provision is. Every one of these agreements has a provision that says the signatory countries, like the United States, quote, shall ensure the conformity of all domestic laws, regulations, and procedures, end quote, with the attached agreements. That's the actual WTO text. What that means is, for instance, U.S. law currently forbids the interstate movement between each U.S. state of products made by the labor of children younger than 16. That's how we have a ban in our country on child labor. The WTO has a rule that basically does not allow countries in making their domestic laws to distinguish the ways in which things are made. A physically identical product has to be treated the same regardless of the labor, environmental, or other conditions. So, for instance, that is the child labor issue. So the U.S. at a certain point realized that our interstate trade in banned child labor products was being undermined by imports from developing countries that permitted child labor. So the U.S. government moved to actually have a new amendment to the law that said, and no products, this was what Senator Harkin wanted, no products made by child labor shall be allowed into the U.S. And immediately a variety of WTO member countries that use child labor wrote to the U.S. and said, we're so sorry. You're not allowed to do that, and if you proceed, we will take you to the WTO. That is a violation. And by the way, that's the same theory, that's the same WTO rule under which we had to roll back our dolphin protections, because the basic rule is unless literally there is dead dolphin in the tuna can, tuna that is caught dolphin safe cannot be distinguished from tuna that is caught killing dolphins. A shoe made by a child laborer bound to a machine and starved cannot be distinguished from a shoe made in the Blue Star OSHA safety plant of plant ownership of a co-op in Maine making a shoe. A shoe is a shoe. You cannot distinguish. And the notion that some tribunal of 3 unelected trade officials would be able to become judge and jury and executioner for a U.S. law that's been made through the domestic democratic process stood up in courts is enraging. Ralph, as you've said, if these rules were ever fully enforced, you would have people on the street in revolt against these trade agreements.
Talking about that, a listener might wonder, why isn't this unconstitutional? Because it's basically overriding our 3 branches of government, federal and state and local.
The way it's written is ingeniously clever. Instead of literally preempting the law, instead of saying, this is now the law, the way it works is that if one country hasn't changed all of its domestic laws, another country at the WTO can drag the first country into one of these WTO foreign tribunals, and the tribunal says, well, United States, you have this obligation, you failed, so either you have 90 days to change your law, and we don't care if it's gone to the Supreme Court, we're telling you, or if you choose not to do that, well, you can just face perpetual trade sanctions. This one looks like it's worth, $12 billion a year. And then we basically have a gun at each temple. Change the law or face perpetual sanctions. In the history of WTO, where there have been several hundred of these cases, by the way, the U.S. has been hit by more challenges than any other single country, footnote. But in the history of these 200 WTO cases where these tribunals have ordered countries to change their domestic laws, there are literally about 4 cases where countries have not done so immediately. The only country, frankly, that just finally stood up and said, fine, we'll pay, was the European Union, not a country, when it was ordered to get rid of its ban on artificial hormones in beef, which are associated with cancer. And the European Union basically said, well, we're going to have revolts of people with steak knives trying to poke their government on the streets if we do this. So we're just going to pay the sanctions. And they paid $300 million a year for 14 years. This case, sadly, the U.S. bought against Europe on behalf of the big cattle exporters. And ultimately, the U.S. negotiators said, I don't think they're going to actually change their law. We may have to settle with them. But they still had to concede a bunch of other tariff access to be able to get us off their back with the sanctions. So with that sanctions sword of Damocles, countries just cave. Hell, half the time you don't even have to take them to tribunal. You just write a challenge threat, and they cave because it costs a fortune to defend these cases.
Lori, what year was the WTO founded? Where are they headquartered? Ralph has been talking about tribunals. Is there any illusion of a democracy where citizens can address the WTO? Is there any parliamentary structure?
No. The WTO went into effect in 1995 on January 1st. It sits in an old palace on the shores of Lake Geneva. I just would note that it has a set of front doors covered in iron grate and 2 Swiss guards out front. And when the doors swing open, it reminds you of the first scene of The Wizard of Oz. But just an aside, and in there, it is kind of the guy behind the curtain because there is no there. Before I really became fully savvy to how insidious this institution was, sort of as naive young lawyer, I would go to Geneva. I would, find something in the text that needed change. This is before the WTO round was completed. And I would go to an official there on food safety, and I'd say, if you put the comma there and have and instead of or, you more or less roll back, 5 decades of food safety improvements. And they say, well, I don't know if that's true, but, we can't help you. You need to go talk to your government. So then I go back to Washington, I'd go to the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, and I'd say, there's this problem here, the comma, the and, the or. And they'd say, we're so sorry, we can't really help you. This is a multi-country negotiation, and it's done in secrecy because it's a matter of foreign policy, and we can't really help you. It was like punching a damn marshmallow. You couldn't gain traction anywhere.
The United Nations has a UN Security Council where we have the United States as a permanent seat. So all votes in the UN are not equal. But are you saying, I don't believe that 160 votes in the WTO are all equal. How
They are all equal.
They are all equal.
Yes, in a pretty infamous case, tiny, one of the smallest population WTO member nations, the nation of Antigua, has sued the United States demanding we get rid of our ban on Internet gambling. And Antigua won. Antigua basically, there's a rule in the WTO, this is the one that also threatens all the financial regulations, that says if you've made a commitment to liberalize a particular service, because service regulation, everything from healthcare, transportation, education, all covered, if you've made a commitment to liberalize, then you can't have any quantitative limits. And a ban on some dangerous activity, that's a forbidden limit. So even though the U.S. claims it took an exception for this, the WTO says, yep, Antigua wins. Antigua population 60,000.
By the way, Antigua has the same vote as China or Germany or the United States if there is ever to be a change in the charter of the WTO. All countries, though, can give 6 months' notice and pull out. But none of them have done that because the retaliation can be pretty severe. Explain Chapter 11 in NAFTA. This one will blow people's minds. And also explain how under the WTO we can't be first, like with seat belts or airbags, because of these harmonization procedures. Can you explain those two before we get into the job loss on the reports you put out regarding NAFTA and other trade agreements.
Well, that's right. Before we get off of WTO, one other thing that folks just need to think about is, as a practical matter, what this is about is taking decisions on the things that will affect your day-to-day life up and away from you, which is to say, think about the battles folks have been involved in across the country to get, for instance, our school lunches coming from local farmers, all the farm-to-school rules. And in all of those rules, we basically are, for instance, using our local school district budgets to try and promote sustainable agriculture, nutritious food for our kids. Then you have rules like in the WTO, decided in Geneva, unappealable, unchangeable through even Congress, unilaterally. We can't do a thing about it. Just, for instance, saying we can't give those kind of local preferences. And while we're talking, there's a procurement chapter that explicitly says no preference to buy local. And while we're talking about food, this gets, Ralph, to the issue you raised about harmonization. That's another of these perverse euphemisms in WTOEs. And that word means making uniform all regulatory standards so as they claim to ease trade. Now, I've made the point, if the point is just uniformity to ease trade, let's all go uniform at the highest standard. Let's all adopt the European standards on food safety. Bon appetit. Unfortunately, the way the WTO is written, there is a ceiling on how strong your standard can be. And you're only presumed to be in compliance with the WTO rules if your standard is lower than that ceiling. So you can be below, because there is no floor, but you can't go higher. And in some chapters, there's a specific rule saying that your standard should comply, your domestic standard, should comply with standards of international organizations. And for food, there's one listed called the Codex Alimentarius. If that sounds like a form of the flu, you would not be off too far. It is a standard-setting body where the actual food multinationals have a seat. And this is a body that, for instance, still allows the use of DDT on fruits and vegetables. Not a set of standards you want to be relying on when you feed your family. Under the WTO rules, the Codex standard, if that's your standard, if you adopt that domestically, which is your obligation, okie dokie. If you have a higher standard, like that European ban on artificial cancer-causing hormones in beef, sorry, you have to get rid of it or you face perpetual trade sanctions. Now, all of that would be bad enough, but now, as you raised, Ralph, Chapter 11 of NAFTA, the investor state enforcement system. So under WTO and under NAFTA, countries can sue other countries in these tribunals. But, countries kind of got to think about it, because what one country is attacking another country for, hell, their law could be like that too. There's a diplomatic screening that goes on. The investor state system gives direct privileges to individual foreign investors and allows them to privately enforce those rights in the foreign tribunals, to demand compensation from our federal treasuries for any domestic policy that the individual company claims violates their new privileges and rights under the trade agreement.
Yeah, give some examples.
An individual company is elevated to the same level as a nation state, literally. So here is an example that I find particularly galling. Under NAFTA, there is a U.S. company called Metalclad. They're in the toxic waste business. They bought an establishment in Mexico that the local government had shut down when it had previously been owned by a Mexican family. And the Mexican company had polluted the groundwater. It hadn't properly disposed of toxic wastes. So all its operating permits were taken away. So the U.S. company comes in and they buy it as what's called a brownfield, as is, no operating permits. And the local government, excited that someone might come in and clean up the place, because they got it as a bargain, basically says, here's what you need to do to get the operating permits. We've done the assessment, clean up this, fix that, add clay over here, etc. The U.S. firm doesn't do any of that. Instead, they come back and say, I'm sorry, we're a foreign investor protected under NAFTA, so we're not actually going to do those things. And we don't care that you made these same obligations for the Mexican company. We're a NAFTA investor, so either allow us to operate this place or you can pay us And they went to one of these investor state tribunals and extracted from the Mexican government $13 million. They never operated the place. They got $13 million because their investor privileges were denied because they couldn't get the permits because they wouldn't clean up the place, and they were treated exactly like the Mexican company that owned it previously. But that's not the anomaly. Over $400 million has been paid out to individual companies under NAFTA on those kind of corporate court attacks on water policy, timber policy, toxic bans. Here's another doozy. Ethel Corporation, the lovely people who put lead in our gasoline for a period of time. Ethel had a gasoline additive called MMT. The stuff is banned in reformulated gasoline in the U.S., and it is a suspected neurotoxin. There are all kinds of serious problems with it. So Canada decides it's going to ban it too. But the way Canada's laws work, they can't, the way their federalist system is set, they can't do a national ban. What they do is they ban interprovincial movement, just like we do on child labor. That's how we get rid of child labor. That's how they get rid of toxic. So they list this ban. Ethel says, yeah, we're really sorry, but you can't do that to us now. NAFTA's in place, and we're a NAFTA investor. And, of course, everyone thought, okay, what the hell is their investment? They don't have a plant there. They just sell a product there. Well, a tribunal basically gives jurisdiction for their case, and they go to the Canadian government and they say, here's the deal. You can get away with just paying us $17 million versus the full loot we're going to get if we go through with this. But you also have to publish an ad in in big newspapers around the world saying the stuff is safe, and you have to reverse your ban. And we'll let you off the hook if you do that. We'll let you settle. And the Canadian company did it. And that junk is back in the gas. And the Canadian government paid millions of dollars for basically not being allowed to regulate. One that's going on right now that's totally outrageous is an attack on Egypt's increase in its minimum wage after its revolution. There is, and this is not under NAFTA. This is a case that is using the similar tribunal system in an agreement between France and Egypt. The European company is basically claiming that the contract it had to do waste pickup, collection, garbage collection in the city of Alexandria, that contract, its rights have been undermined because the increase in the minimum wage will undermine the profits. And the final one is just to raise because it's just so stunning. There's a recent case that had over $40 billion in award. Up until recently, the biggest case was a $10 billion award, and before that it was a $3 billion award. And those that all have to do with oil, mining, or gas cases. The big companies, Occidental, Chevron, are using this mechanism to beat the stuffing out of countries. Oh, and then, there's Eli Lilly using this regime to try and attack Canada's patent system for medicines, because Canada, as we all know, has lower prices. And, Philip Morris using these secret corporate tribunals to attack the cigarette plain packaging rules in both Australia and Uruguay. It's an epidemic of corporate power attacks. And this system, which was in NAFTA, could be expanded enormously if President Obama gets his way with his Pacific and his European proposed agreements.
That's my question, Lori. This is all outrageous, and you're an amazing voice speaking out against this. What is wrong with Obama? Why is he pushing this? Who's advising him? What possible rationale could he have for our own laws being undermined by some corporate world organization?
Especially after his 2008 election promises, Laurie, mention that. And then go to Congress, fast track, and congressional abdication here.
Well, first of all, everyone can see President Obama's pledges. He pledged he would get rid of the investor state tribunal system. I mean, the guy was a constitutional law professor. He knows how outrageous this is. He pledged that he would replace the fast-track trade authority system we're about to talk about, a very undemocratic Nixon-era procedure that even more takes away our democracy in these trade policy areas. He said a lot of great stuff, and you can see all of it live with footnotes at our website, which is www.tradewatch.org. That's tradewatch.org, tradewatch one word. And you can also there see the only complete list of all the investor state cases under U.S. agreements, where we've summarized the case, translated it out of gobbledygook. These rulings are like 500 pages long. But we also put links. So if you want to torture yourself and read the damn upsetting cases, you can go back to the original source. And that's also at tradewatch.org. Because when folks first hear about these investor-state systems, they have two reactions. One, the person talking about it is crazy and paranoid. Sadly, not the case. This really is happening. Or two, they say what you say. Well, how the heck could President Obama want that? How could he be pushing more of that?
Yeah, what is wrong with him?
And what is wrong with him? And I have to say, my initial thing I always say is, because people have feelings about this. I'm equal part heartbroken and hot, raging furious about it because he's got to know better, but he's pushing a system that totally contradicts his basic policies. And the answer I have of why, best I can tell, has to do with the 600 official corporate advisors who, by statute, have an official role in setting U.S. trade policy, and the silo in the White House of people like our current trade representative and the president's law school buddy, Mike Froman, a Citibank alum, a guy who was with Robert Rubin during the Clinton administration, a guy who's one of the last mitigated lovers of NAFTA amongst Democrats. The president is hearing from the corporate advisors. The president is hearing from his own senior economic staff, and they have a take on this that is either intentionally omitting these big problems, or they have convinced themselves for their own convenience that these concerns are not such a big deal. So they'll go one by one through all these cases and explain to you why, well, actually, maybe metal-clad, maybe that wasn't a bad decision. Maybe that should have happened. And as someone who actually has bothered to read these cases, actually, I wish I could just lock the president up for 6 hours and have him read 3 or 4 of these cases as compared to getting the filter. But we know better. The guy's got to know. And he's made this decision for political purposes. He's made this decision because there is a horrifying elite consensus, uninformed, I might add, in support of these agreements. It's breaking. For instance, unlike NAFTA, where all these guys supported it, Sachs, Stiglitz, Krugman have actually now researched what's in the agreements versus just a knee-jerk, oh, it's free trade, I like it. And they have come out, all three of those guys, against the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the agreement where President Obama would expand this model. So how could he possibly, there's the what the hell is he thinking, but then there's also the how the hell could this happen? And that gets the issue Ralph raised, which is fast track. So a lot of people who are listening to this are thinking, so was the entire Congress lobotomized or drunk the day that the WTO or NAFTA came up for a vote? Like, how could these guys possibly, Democrats or Republicans, hell, just think about it from their own turf. What's the point of Congress if you got this extra judicial system above you? Why did these guys approve this? And part of the answer is the power of all the corporations who love this stuff. It's their way to get these policies that they couldn't possibly get in the sunshine of open process. But the other piece is fast track. So this is a procedure that Nixon cooked up to basically railroad trade agreements through Congress. And before that, to allow a form of really diplomatic legislating, where executive branch negotiators with all these corporate advisors, literally 600 official ones, are newly empowered to not just negotiate trade terms, but to actually go beyond trade. And with Nixon's fast track in 1973, for the first time, our trade negotiators are allowed to set binding terms that will be binding in Congress and state legislatures, on service sector regulations like energy and climate policy. Now we think of it on intellectual property, so medicine prices, internet freedom, on what they call standards, but we would call product safety, food safety, environmental rules. All of a sudden they have this new power. For 200 years prior to that, trade agreements only dealt with border taxes, tariffs, and they only dealt with real trade. And so fast track both opened the floodgates for this backdoor legislating via secret trade negotiations and set up a procedure to make sure that these overreach agreements would basically be railroaded through Congress.
Explain fast track. When the president sends the Pacific Trade Agreement to Congress, what is fast track?
So that's just where I was going to go. So funny little thing, that Boston Tea Party that we all learned about as kids, that was actually a trade war. So the founding fathers, when they wrote the constitutions, they had all been steeped in that history, and they decided that, they weren't going to give power over trade to the king, the executive branch. In fact, they gave exclusive authority in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1.8, to Congress. It's one of the biggest checks and balances in the entire Constitution. Congress has explicit, exclusive authority over trade policy, but only the executive branch can negotiate with foreign countries. So they have to cooperate. And for 200 years of the history of our country, Congress just told the executive branch negotiators what to do. In comes fast track. This is what Nixon got Congress to agree to. Number one, the president unilaterally picks the country. Number two, the president negotiates an agreement. Congress gives objectives, but they aren't binding. The president can then, 3, sign the agreement and enter into it before Congress gets a vote. 4, write an implementing legislation bill that changes all U.S. laws needed to conform to the agreement and adopts the actual damn text of the thing as U.S. federal law. So it just preempts all state law.
But Congress has to agree to the fast track first, right?
Well, just to finish what it does, 5, that's not subject to committee markup or amendment. 6, guaranteed vote in 90 days from the day the president writes and drops the bill. And then that vote happens with no amendments and only 20 hours of debate, including in the Senate. Yes, the Congress would have to give this authority, and here's the only good news. Number one, Ralph, I don't think we're going to get to a vote on TPP if we all do our work, because that agreement, the more we drag it out into the sunshine, we can pull the old Dracula strategy on it. It's not an agreement that fares well if discussed in public, and there are campaigns underway in all of the 12 countries involved in what is NAFTA on steroids with Asia, and in these countries, folks just fighting back against what it would mean for their lives has stalled their being able to sign it for 2 years. Now, one of the big things in the U.S. that's keeping it from getting signed, Congress won't give fast-track authority. So this is something Congress would have to delegate. It's something Congress would have to give up. And in the 20 years since NAFTA and WTO started to wake up Congress to the reality, these trade agreements weren't really about trade. This was their turf they were giving away. Congress has only allowed fast track for 5 of those 20 years. And in fact, the 171 Democrats and 71 Republicans voted down fast track on the House floor for Clinton in 1998. Mr. Trade Expansion, hundreds of trade agreements. Only 2 of them had fast track. Guess which ones? NAFTA and WTO. Real trade agreements don't need fast track. And so our mission, if any of this worries you, our mission as Americans who want to be part of this global campaign against these overreach agreements, our mission is to make sure our Congress does not delegate fast track authority. Whatever you think about the Congress, as an institution, it has to be the check on the president just unilaterally using these trade negotiations and their 600 corporate advisors to roll back all of these important policies we all rely on. So no fast track, full debate, full exposure. The TPP would not fare well under that treatment.
That's
so
the
that
Pacific Trade Agreement. Yeah,
the
Trans-Pacific
Trans-Pacific.
Yeah. Laurie, you've actually forged a left-right coalition in the House. You've got the numbers now to block Obama if he sends the Pacific Trade Agreement to it. Is that right?
The numbers are around fast track. So when President Clinton had fast track denied to him in Congress, it was a bipartisan no vote. And the issues around trade that go to sovereignty, that go not so much about what the policy is, but who decides, and is it permanent? Is Congress have any role in the future in setting these policies if we're locking in policy in a trade agreement? Who has the constitutional authority? Those are all issues that work for Democrats and Republicans as far as having real concerns about fast track. So when President Obama, breaking his pledge to replace fast track, started pushing for it already in 2013, you had 180 Democrats and about 30 Republicans send letters saying, whatever we think about trade, we oppose this old fast track. That's a delegation of way too much authority. We have different views on trade, but we agree. That's no way to make policy. Even with the Republican increase, it's going to be very hard. If we all do our work and talk to Democratic and Republican House members both, if we do our work, there's not going to be fast track, and that will be our help of not having TPP.
And that reflects Laurie and others' work with the grassroots all over the country. Before we let you go, Laurie, you've talked about the impact on consumers, contaminated food, price of medicines, the impact on the environment. You've put out reports on the impact on job loss in this country, because the big rationalization for these trade agreements is, well, it creates jobs. Why don't you just briefly summarize your findings, particularly with NAFTA, on the job creation issue?
Well, I haven't focused on that because I think, the polling shows Americans, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans all know that these trade agreements have offshored millions of American jobs and pushed their wages down. And people have lived that experience, so they know it. But the data is compelling. And we have, again, at tradewatch.org, www.tradewatch.org, we have all of the studies that basically have the data that support people's instincts. So the summary of it is, since NAFTA and WTO, the United States has lost 5 million net manufacturing jobs. That was 1 out of every 4 manufacturing job that was in place in 1992 before NAFTA and WTO. We have seen real wages hover at 1972 levels. And I wanted to say something about that because the connection there with trade is direct. Under trade theory, the benefit of trade is on the import side. So some people may lose their jobs, but if everyone has cheaper stuff, then the benefit across society is a plus. The problem is, as we have outsourced, offshored, higher and higher wage jobs through our trade agreements, through those investor rules I was describing, which of course incentivize offshoring. Who wouldn't like to be a foreign investor? If you can raid the other country's treasury, it actually promotes companies to relocate. So with those kind of rules, we now are seeing offshoring at such a high wage level that even when you have a savings on the import side as a consumer, the net is no longer positive because we have such a loss in wage levels. So Department of Labor's data shows that when a manufacturing worker loses a job to trade and gets reemployed, on average they lose 30% of their wages. About 2 years ago, a group of economists tried to apply the theory of free trade to the current data. So they figured out what we all saved on imported goods, cheaper stuff, and then they looked at the wage loss caused by offshoring and what the median wage now was. And what they found is, on the median, every household is losing $3,000 in income net. So cheaper stuff outweighed by lower wages thanks to our current offshore job promoting trade agreements. All of that would be gruesome enough, but also if you're pushing down wages for a lot of people, you're obviously having a contribution to inequality. And one of the most recent papers we published is a literature survey of the last 10 years of studies from conservative economists, lefty economists. The one thing they all agree on, one of the major contributors to growing economic inequality is our current trade policies. The only thing they fight about is what the degree is. And, some of the think tanks that support NAFTA and WTO, a very prominent one, the Peterson Institute in D.C., says it's 39% of the effect is caused by our trade policy of growing income inequality. So very practically, you can look at the casualties of NAFTA. If you go to tradewatch.org and you go to the Trade Data Center, thanks to a Freedom of Information request, we have all of the official government trade adjustment assistance certified job losses from trade agreements. Now, this is not a full count. Unfortunately, 1.5 million people are on that list, but it's an undercount. It's just one program for certain kind of workers who can qualify for extra unemployment. but it gives you a sense of whose jobs are going. It's not the old saying of, oh, these are low-tech, low-wage jobs. We want better jobs. Let's send those overseas. No, siree. These are high-tech jobs. These are chip manufacturers. These are aerospace manufacturers. These are computer companies. And increasingly, we're offshoring our service sector jobs so that we actually are seeing a lot of areas of engineering, computer programming, legal work, all going offshore in the service sector provisions of the agreements, which guarantee free movement of information. Now, just to drop one more consumer issue in there, of course, the implications for moving all of our financial information, our health information, our legal information to offshore producers, as well as pushing down wages here, of course, is an enormous privacy threat, because a lot of that data has privacy protections in the U.S., but once it goes global, it can get treated any old way. And how many people have seen these ransom rigs where you basically get an email, I have your Social Security number and blah, blah, blah health information. Send me this much money or else. Half of it's real because the stuff's being outsourced when the jobs are getting offshored.
Laurie, the next step, we try to tell the listeners what they can do. It's quite easy in this case. Number one, you go to tradewatch.org. It's a marvelous can-do as well as informative in clear language about the perfidious trade uber alles, suppressing our labor, environmental, and consumer standards, usurping our sovereignty, and weakening our economy and wrecking our democratic rights. So once you get all that, you have some meetings with your neighbors or your co-workers, and then you fire off a letter to your senators and representatives saying, where do you stand? And you've had plenty of time, Senator and Representative, to think about it. Where do you stand on this proposed Pacific Trade Agreement? And are you going to make corporate managed trade an election issue in the next election? We want your answer in writing, and we're sending our letter to various media in our district and other citizen groups so that you know that other people will get this demand. That's what you got to do. And all it takes is 10, 15 people here and there in the Crescent District, and the tremors will be heard on Capitol Hill, and Laurie and her people will have a good infrastructure when they go in and out of these senators and representatives' office.
Well, let me add one thing, because this is fun, this is adventurous, and this is something folks can do solo. If you don't have the time to get your neighbors involved, though, please do follow Ralph's advice. You can just be a solo bird dogging operation. So what's that mean? If you go to your member of Congress, and we're talking about the House of Representatives, so the representative, if you go to their website, and by the way, if you don't know who your representative is, it's very easy to find out. You call the Capitol switchboard, which is 202-225-3121. Give them your zip code. They'll tell you the name of the member of Congress. Hell, they'll directly connect you if you want to give them a piece of your mind about fast track or TPP. So you just go to the website of your member of Congress, and they will have a public schedule listed. This is where they're going to cut a ribbon. This is where they're going to give away Thanksgiving turkeys. This is where they're going to light a Christmas tree. And you just go as one of the constituents in that district when they're in a town near you, and you go up to the member of Congress perfectly kindly, respectfully, introduce yourself as a constituent, and loudly enough so those around you can hear, simply ask in public, hey, are you going to give away your authority to protect me from another bad trade agreement by giving up the fast-track authority? I elected you because I want you to stand up for me. I hear about this fast-track. You're against that, right? Can you make sure you're against that? And then you sit there and stare them down until they give you an answer. And if it's weasel words, keep asking. Then you shake their hand and say, here's my name and my number. Can you send that to me in writing, please? That is a stunt that, frankly, is worth numerous group meetings, because you've just gone to a member's safe space, the events they've set up, and in front of other constituents, you put them on the spot, and a lot of them will give you the right answer, and give them a hug. Tell them thank you. That's the right thing. Do that to Republicans, too. This is not a partisan issue. That's what we all need to be doing, because in January, the fast-track fight is going to become hand-to-hand combat. There's a 6-month window at the beginning of 2015 where both the fast-track decision, whether or not there will be fast-track, and the fate of the TPP are going to be decided. And we're going to win if a lot of people stand up and talk to the members of Congress directly. We need to make this a bottom-up buzz.
A key point, what she's saying to you folks, is in personam lobbying your senator and representative. In personam, no indirection, no rallies going into the ether, although rallies are good. In personam, when they come back to your district for ceremonies or an occasional town meeting, you can get their schedule the way Laurie suggested you do. Well, we're run out of time, Laurie. We want to thank you very much. Give the website once more. That's your asset, folks, this website.
It's www.tradewatch.org. You can get the local data printed out and bring it to your member of Congress. Just put in your zip code to that trade data center. You can get unemployment data from trade. You can get the list of the companies certified as trade casualties. You can make it incredibly personal. They're talking points. They're fact sheets. You can go from the book length, because we literally wrote a book on Fast Track, down to a one-page fact sheet. Whatever works for you, we've got it at tradewatch.org.
Thank you very much, Laurie. You'll see that the Sunday talk shows have not made this an issue, but you out there can make it a very powerful issue, because the public opinion is turning dramatically against these corporate managed trade agreements that undermine our democracy and standard of living and health and safety. Thanks a lot, Laurie.